Last spring, a researcher opened her email and learned that a study NIH had asked her to expand was no longer going to be funded. Not because the science was wrong, not because the budget was wrong, because the study was about women. She runs a 6-person research team in her department. The grant had been awarded, the award had been pulled, and she sat down at her morning meeting and told her team, "Don't worry about it. Let me worry about it." For the last few months, I've been talking to leaders at academic medical centers across California about what is actually happening to research right now, to women's health research specifically, and to the people doing it. This is the Resilience Playbook. Episode 1, The Disruption. Here's what I learned. To understand what these leaders are navigating, you need a quick timeline. In late January and February of 2025, the National Institutes of Health terminated more than 2,000 active research grants. The exact number was 2,291. The dollars pulled were $2.45 billion. A peer-reviewed analysis in PNAS from later that year by Liu and colleagues looked at who got hit. The terminations fell disproportionately on minority researchers and on researchers studying health equity, gender identity, and women's health. That's not a side effect. That's the pattern. If you want to know what that meant on the ground, in the first 6 months after the terminations, 1 in every 30 NIH-funded clinical trials had its funding pulled midstream. Feynman published this. Of the trials that lost funding, about a third were actively recruiting patients when the cut came. That means real people were enrolled in real studies, and the studies stopped. And here is the mechanism behind it that almost nobody outside the research community knows. Until 2025, the NIH Payline, the percentile cutoff for getting funded, was around 9 to 10%. Tight, but workable. What changed is that NIH started docking the entire 5-year budget of a new grant from the available pool the moment they award it. The math means the effective payline collapsed from about 10% to about 4%. A lab director I spoke with described it like this. Quote, "At 4%, nobody gets funded. You have to have a perfect grant, and even then, it's hard." End quote. She also told me they killed the R35 program. The R35 program provides long-term, stable funding to investigators rather than specific projects. R35 paid more than half her lab. So when leaders talk about a funding crisis, this is what they mean. It is not vibes. It is mechanical. The pool shrank by 60%. A department lost grant funding for studies that used fetal tissue from elective termination. They lost an entire arm of a center grant called a P50. A vice chair described it like this in our interview. Quote, "We had a study that was actually returned to us by the NIH, requesting that we increase our budget, which almost never happens. And then we just got a simple notice saying that it wasn't going to be funded. It was directly due to the administration change." End quote. And here's the second timeline pin. In March 2025, the Trump administration moved to dissolve USAID. By the time the dust settled, 86% of all USAID awards had been canceled. A paper just out in The Lancet, Cavalcanti and colleagues projected the global health consequences. They modeled what happens if those cuts continue. Their projection, more than 14 million additional deaths worldwide by 2030. About 4.5 million of those would be children under 5. For a department, USAID supported a huge global health portfolio, maternal health and infant survival in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Uganda, Malawi, Kenya. A separate paper, Buddha and Rulisa in Obstetric Medicine, estimated that the freeze alone, just within 2025, would result in more than 4 million additional unintended pregnancies and over 8,000 additional maternal deaths. So that's the macro picture. Federal grants pulled, global health infrastructure dismantled. The numbers are not abstract. The second piece of the disruption is more subtle, but in some ways more chilling. There's a list. In 2025, Forbes published a piece that included roughly 200 words that, if they appeared in an NIH or NSF grant proposal, would trigger an additional ideological alignment review. Words like gender, disparities, women, marginalized, trauma, the list is real. The review process it triggers is real, and most leaders I interviewed knew about it. In December 2025, Meta and Jenna published a study in the BMJ. They analyzed 17,701 NIH grant abstracts. They tracked diversity-related language between January 2024 and June 2025. They found a 25% overall decline in those words. And in within-grant pairwise comparisons, same grant, same scientists, same area of research, but renewed in 2025, diversity terms were deleted at 10 times the rate of other words. That is not a change in what is being studied. That is a change in what scientists are allowed to write down. In our interviews, every leader described this experience differently. A vice chair told me, quote, "They've got a computational text tool to look for the kinds of words that you saw in the Forbes list. It's used upon submission of a proposal, and then at the end, twice." End quote. A lab director put it the most directly. Quote, "I just don't put gender. You can't stop saying women, but you have to watch language. You don't use diversity. You don't use gender. You don't use women. You're careful even saying female. They're trying to erase women." End quote. That last line is the one I can't stop thinking about. They're trying to erase women from a research vocabulary that exists to study women's bodies. A research director said, quote, "There are words that we can't use. There have been a lot of uses of the thesaurus." End quote. So leaders are doing one of three things. They're rewording, they're abandoning, or when they have political cover, they're fighting the rejection and getting reinstated. The division chief I interviewed mentioned that there have been red state legislators who've intervened to get specific grants funded after they were flagged. So the algorithm is not omnipotent, but you have to know who to call. And most scientists don't. Here's the deeper question this raises, and it's something Bolman and Deal's organizational analysis names directly. Bolman and Deal, leadership theorists, describe 4 frames that any institution operates inside: structural, human resource, political, and symbolic. The symbolic frame is about ritual, story, and language. When you strip language from research, you're not just changing rules, you're changing the symbolic frame meaning of the work itself. You're saying these populations are not legible to the federal infrastructure. That's a much bigger break than fill out a different form. The lexical strategy work is real labor. It is being done at the department level by research directors and program officers every day. And the leaders who pool that labor, who share what cleared the filter, who keep a running list of synonym swaps that worked. Those leaders compress the cycle time for their entire division. The leaders who leave it as a solo PI burden lose more grants and more morale to the same problem. There's a third piece of the disruption story that didn't make a lot of news, but it came up over and over in my interviews. Listen to how the vice chair described the institutional response. Quote, "In our institution, the directives were that individual principal investigators were the first line of defense, which was truly difficult because this was a federal government, a full federal government executive, with all the force and strength of the federal government to dismantle the kind of research we do. And they were saying that the intervention to counteract that should be just individual researchers, which doesn't even compute, doesn't even make sense," end quote. She's naming a structural mismatch. Federal government action at scale is being met with individual principal investigator a response. At scale. As if a single grant writer adjusting their proposal language is a counterweight to executive orders that affect billions of dollars across thousands of institutions. The math does not work, and every leader I talked to felt this. Why isn't institutional leadership stepping in? Two reasons that came up. First, many universities are themselves under Federal Department of Justice investigation. Speaking publicly about funding cuts is politically expensive, so institutions go quiet. Second, fundraising priorities at the chancellor level are tied up in capital projects and donor relations. The vice chair told me that even when she went to her university's development office to ask for emergency research fundraising, the priority was a hospital building, not the research that was being dismantled. So what stepped in to fill the gap? Department-level leadership, division chiefs, vice chairs, and program directors. They started running coordination work that institutions weren't running. Vice chairs moved their meetings from quarterly to monthly. Departments began running joint coordination calls. Cross-PI solidarity emerged where institutional response stalled. Apkowitz and Hromas, in a 2018 piece in Blood Advances, made an argument that turned out to be prescient. He said, when federal funding becomes unstable, the right intervention layer is not individual researchers and not the institution. It's professional societies, nonprofit organizations, and coordinated department-level structures. He used the American Society of Hematology's Bridge Grant Program as the case study. That program returned about a 7-fold ROI in subsequent NIH funding for grantees. The architecture exists, we just have to use it. Sott and Bender, in a 2024 systematic review in the Journal of Human Resources, looked at adaptive leadership across crisis settings, health, public sector, military. They found a consistent pattern. Hybrid hierarchical collaborative response patterns outperform pure institutional response or pure individual response. The leaders in my interviews are doing exactly that, hybrid response at the department level, filling the gap their institutions cannot publicly fill. That's not a failure mode. That's the design that works. So that is the disruption. Federal grants pulled at scale, a computational filter on the language of science, and an institutional layer that, for political reasons it cannot name, has handed responsibility to individual researchers. That's the environment these leaders walked into in 2025. And it's the environment they're navigating right now. In the next episode, The Response, I want to talk about what they're doing about it. Specifically, the leadership behaviors that show up across all 6 interviews I conducted. The pattern of shielding teams from uncertainty, the patchwork funding strategies, and the way leaders are preserving inclusive practice in their teams when the labels for inclusion have been stripped from the funding. There's a phrase one of the leaders used, quote, "Let me do the worrying," that I cannot stop thinking about. Next episode, we'll get into why. Until then, thank you for listening. The full reference list and show notes for this episode are in the description. This is the Resilience Playbook,